We must continue working to build trust between communities and law enforcement. We must continue working to guarantee every person in this country equal justice under the law.
Making a plea for Americans to reject violence. That's current Attorney General Loretta Lynch addressing the nation, expressing grief for the loss of life in those shootings around the country this week. The Department of Justice has opened a civil rights investigation, or two civil rights investigations, into the deaths of Alton Sterli in Louisiana and Philando Castile in Minnesota. Let's get the perspective of a man who knows the system inside and out. Welcome back to the Hardline, former Attorney General and current Dean at Belmont University College of Law, the Honorable Alberto Gonzales. A pleasure to speak with you.
It's good to be back.
All right, so General, we look at this, and of course, almost immediately after these shootings in Dallas took place, you heard the president call for gun control. I know you talked about gun control recently. Were you surprised how quickly, we know they have a tendency to do this in the past, but were you surprised how quickly the president pivoted towards focus on gun control?
No, I wasn't. Listen. Obviously, anytime there's a shooting, that's an issue that's raised by proponents of gun control as a solution. Obviously, we have a Second Amendment in this country which does allow law-abiding citizens to have access to guns with certain reasonable restrictions. And as long as the Second Amendment exists, that right will continue, and people will continue to own guns here in America. And what we need to be emphasizing is responsible gun ownership, and we need to ensure that the database that we have to do background checks is accurate and complete as possible. So there are things that we can do and should do, quite frankly, but honestly, gun control is not the answer ultimately to some of these senseless killings.
Of course, you know what it's like to sit in Loretta Lynch's shoes. She, as well as Eric Holder, they've done these civil rights investigations many times under the Obama administration. But the same problem keeps being raised by the Black Lives Matter movement. Do you expect any difference as a result of this in these civil rights investigations?
Well, it depends on what is uncovered in connection with the investigations. And what's going to happen here is the department has to determine whether or not race played a factor in these shootings, and so they want to know the motivation. They want to know the circumstances of the shootings, and obviously they'll talk to the officers and they'll talk to witnesses and bystanders. They'll look into the background of the officers to see if there's been a history of any kind of prejudice or racism in the history of these officers. These are very difficult cases to make, quite frankly, because of the fact that it is the investigation is focused on whether or not was the killing motivated by hatred based upon race.
Well, let's talk about the president. I mentioned his response. We have that clip. Let's go ahead and take a listen. This is President Obama speaking. Of course, he's in Poland for the NATO summit this week, but it came up. Let's take a listen. Here's the president.
Today is a wrenching reminder of the sacrifices that they make for us. We also know that when people are armed with powerful weapons, unfortunately, it makes attacks like these more deadly and more tragic.
Again, this is somewhat difficult. Obviously, there's a racial component to all this, and the president talks about gun control here. Is he doing the right things when it comes to the racial aspect of this?
Well, I don't know whether or not his comment, that particular comment, was based upon the racial aspects of what's going on here. I think it was sort of his plea to try to do something to get rid of the high-powered weapons that exist on the streets, and that really is a legitimate concern. I've talked to a lot of law enforcement who are concerned about the level of firepower that they have to confront every day. I don't believe there is a constitutional right to own certain kinds of weapons.
Okay, so let me talk about that with you, because there has been this discussion, and there seems to be some willingness to at least talk about some parts of this in Congress. Do you think it's time for Republicans to promote what you just talked about?
Well, I do believe that I think the Supreme Court would find that you don't have a constitutional right to own certain kinds of weapons, so I have no problem with the discussion about limiting access to certain kinds of weapons. But obviously, people have different views in terms of what the Second Amendment permits, and that'll be a very spirited discussion in our Congress. But do
you think the majority of Republicans in Congress are in step with the American public in terms of the way they feel about high-powered weapons?
That I don't know. I do believe that they probably are out of step with how the American public feels about additional background checks only about 60-65% of transactions today involving guns are subject to background checks, and I think they clearly are constitutional, and I think the American people would support increased background checks. I, for one, believe that it's appropriate to increase the number of transactions that are subject to background checks, not to 100%. I, for example, believe that a private sale between myself and my neighbor should not be.
Sure, yourself and your neighbor or a relative, nobody's arguing against that.
I'm
but
not suggesting 100%, but I would only support increasing the number of transactions subject to background checks if we can assure ourselves that the data in the database is accurate and complete, and we can assure ourselves that the information will not be used by the federal government for any other purpose. But this is one area where I think there is common ground, but I also believe that many Republicans are out of steps with the American public with respect to increased background checks.
Well, the Democrats, we only have about 30 seconds, would say that the NRA is driving that. They're forcing Congress to be out of step. Do you agree with that, yes or no?
I'm not going to comment on, that's sort of out of my lane in terms of the political power of the NRA, but obviously there's been a lot of reporting that the NRA has an enormous amount of sway with respect to certain Republican lawmakers.
All right. Well, that's probably a debate for another day, but we know the Democrats will raise that again as they continue to talk about gun control in these tragedies. But we do want to think about the officers that lost their lives. And Attorney General Alberto Gonzales, I know you being a Texan, this hits home especially close to you. So our thoughts are with you and everyone involved in Dallas. Thanks for being with us.
You bet.